What do you think is the most incredible, let's say, fact that the average person has no clue about?
In reality, turns out that an individual neuron, just one single nerve cell in the brain, is way more complex in terms of what computations it carries out. So there is a lot of computational power packed inside one neuron. It's got multiple points of nonlinearities, so it's got a very rich dendritic tree. If you want to approximate that sort of input to output transformation of a single neuron, you need a convolutional neural network. It's a convolution in time of like, I think it's 6 or 7 layers of a network, just to approximate whatever a single neuron does in the brain.
Artem Kirsanov is a guest researcher at the Center for Computational Neuroscience and a Ph.D. student at the NYU Center for Neuroscience. He studies how the brain builds memories and perceptions that change with fluctuating motives. And he investigates the task-relevant geometry of latent representations in biological and artificial neural networks. He's also one of my favorite YouTubers and covers the above topics on his wonderful channel. Chapters with timestamps are broken out below. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Artem, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. It's great to meet you in person. When I reached out to you, I had no idea you were in New York City. And so I thought, why not do this in person, right?
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. It's actually my first time doing something like that in person.
Yeah. In person? Yeah, well, you had one other interview with Sense of Mind.
Yeah.
Right, from a couple of years ago, but that was over Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, we have you in the flesh. And so, I mean, you're growing. You've got a big subscriber base, almost like 150,000, maybe even more.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. YouTube,
Good.
YouTube's a little bit slow on updating that depending on where you look.
Really?
I was at a party the other day, and someone was looking me up, and they were like, "Oh, 39,000 subscribers." I was like, "No, I'm at 45,000." Well, you got to go to my page and check that out. So yeah, you're growing a lot. So these in-person interviews, they might start for you. So just to get us kicked off, can you tell us about your journey going from biophysics in Moscow to now you're a computational neuroscientist at NYU? Can you tell us about that path?
Sure. Yeah, so last year I finished my undergraduate. I graduated Lomonosov Moscow State University with a bachelor in biophysics. And the reason I chose biophysics, it's kind of hard to explain because of the differences in the educational system, right? But basically, in undergraduate in Russia, you are kind of choosing your major after 2 years. So I was a part of the Department of Biology in general, and generally, first 2 years, everyone has the same curriculum. So basic biology, from things like biology of plants to cellular biology, stuff like that. So just to bring everyone up to speed. And then I chose biophysics because my advisor at the time, Dr. Alexei Brage, he was affiliated with the Department of Biophysics, but he was doing, and he is still doing, computational neuroscience, essentially. And I really loved the work that he was doing, so I reached out to him even before I applied to biophysics, saying hey, can I work in the lab? I really like what you're doing. Yeah, and we met and started doing research in comp neuro. Basically, I worked on analysis of theta rhythms, wrote some code for wavelet transforms and picking up significant sort of theta rhythm episodes and characterizing them. Yeah, but yeah, that's how I got into biophysics, because of my advisor at the time, and then I graduated. So it's four years in total, an undergraduate degree, and then moved here for my Ph.D. in neuroscience at the Center for Neuroscience at NYU. Yeah, actually, finished my first year. So because we're recording this in June. So, yeah. The first year completed.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, What was it about your advisors before you started to work with him? What was it about his work that spoke to you?
I would say he was one of the few people who were doing like computational neuroscience. So because usually it's often that if you look at like the Department of Neuroscience, right, a lot of it is either cognitive or behavioral. While even at the time, even in undergraduate, I was really interested at the intersection of machine learning and neuroscience. I wanted to understand what is it about neurons that makes them such great computational devices, right? How is the information is encoded and processed in neural circuits? Yeah, and I think in my undergraduate university, right, he was pretty much one of the very few people who worked in that realm. Yeah, and I really liked his work with regards to like different. I probably will not get into detail of like different directions, but yeah, there was a lot of interesting things that really resonated with me in terms of like the computational techniques that he employed, both in analysis and modeling.
Very cool. Was that, did you do experiments with mice? Was that, I think I saw something like...
Yeah. So in undergraduate, I was working in the laboratory, the laboratory of extrasynaptic signaling, led by Alexei Semyonov, also at Moscow, and my advisor, he was like affiliated with that lab as well. So I was partially at Moscow State University. Sometimes I was in the lab, but I never did any experimental work. I was purely like a computational person. Yeah, I tried a few times, but then I realized that I don't really like experiments.
Oh,
yeah, it's just I don't know. I guess the main reason is I feel like I'm not really good with my hands. I feel like I'm a bit clumsy. Yeah, I tried doing 2 surgeries on mice just to implant the electrodes. And the success rate was exactly 50%. So one of them died, one of them more or less survived. But it was not an enjoyable experience for me.
Okay, bummer. Small sample.
Yeah. But
also, a beginner, you're going to screw up sometimes. It's not that bad.
Yeah. But I feel like, if I enjoyed the process, that would be like definitely, you would definitely get better and better at it. But I realized that I would much rather just analyze the data and do some modeling, from my computer rather than going into the lab and like actually handling mice. So.
Yeah. Working from home is so much better than going in.
Exactly. I was telling like all of my classmates who are going to the lab, I was like, I don't have to get up from my bed to go to the lab. I just need to grab my laptop.
Yeah, do it from bed. That's awesome. One thing I'd like to ask you about too, and it could be from your own personal research or, just from the large breadth of things that you've read over the years and learned about. What are some of the most significant findings or breakthroughs that you've learned about in your studies thus far?
You mean in terms of what I researched as like findings by other people, right? That I did.
Yeah, let's do both. Let's say something from your own personal experience, something you've worked on, and then after that we can cover maybe something more broadly. Yeah.
I would say so during my undergrad, because I was working on analysis of theta rhythm in the hippocampus, I read a lot of hippocampal literature. And particularly I fell in love with the book written by Yuri Buzhaki, who's actually a professor here at NYU, who's doing hippocampal physiology. The book is called The Brain from Inside Out. I feel like I even mentioned it in one of the videos. But yeah, a lot of it, there's a lot of really good nuggets of information in that book, but because Yuri is a hippocampal physiologist, there is a lot of hippocampal insights into the hippocampus. And then I also read the majority of his papers. And I became really fascinated by that idea that hippocampus kind of constructs a general purpose cognitive map of the world, that it's like kind of an internal representation not only of outside physical environment, right, but there is also data that hippocampus operates with like non-spatial variables, so it may be something more general purpose, right? And Yuri, I think, refers to the hippocampus as the librarian of the brain. So if you view the cortex as kind of a library, right, with a whole bunch of books, and it's a really daunting task to find, proper books, right, that you need right now, and how to efficiently store that information into the cortex. And hippocampus, at least that's the idea, that it sort of indexes the cortex to read and write information. And yeah, it's a really beautiful line of work.
All right, so Yuri stuff. So we'll recommend that book, and I'll include that in the description for folks that want to track down the book, The Brain from Inside Out. So that's why I have to assume that's one of your favorite books, if that's stuck out to you. Okay.
Definitely recommend it.
Yeah. That's cool. So I will take a look at that. And what do you say, I guess, even more, it could be in neuroscience, it could be from, say, computational stuff or things you've done, personal work, let's say, but could even be more broadly. What do you think is the most incredible, let's say, fact that the average person has no clue about?
Oh, that's a tough one. About the brain?
Whatever comes up first. Yeah, I guess whatever kind of jumps to mind, pops to mind first, yeah.
I would say it's, and I think this is partially caused by like the terminology established in machine learning and all of these neural networks. Everybody hears around them, right, from every corner. They're super popular right now. And what people refer to as neurons, right, in these artificial models, right? Neurons in the machine learning sense, they are really primitive computational devices that just take the weighted sum of the inputs and then apply a single nonlinear activation function, like a ReLU or something like that. And because so many people are referring to them as neurons, right? That's kind of like a historical thing that they were based off of very early views of what neurons might be doing. But in reality, turns out that an individual neuron, just one single nerve cell in the brain, is way more complex in terms of what computations it carries out. So there is a lot of computational power packed inside one neuron. It's got multiple points of nonlinearities. So it's got a very rich dendritic tree. And whatever inputs are fed onto this dendritic tree, right? Before that input is sort of transformed into the output, a binary decision whether a neuron fires or not, there is a very rich computation being done on the level of dendrites, sort of how voltage flows along the neuron and all of different points of nonlinearity on dendrites. And I actually talk about in one of my videos that if you want to approximate that sort of input to output transformation of a single neuron, you need a convolutional neural network. It's a convolution in time of like, I think it's 6 or 7 layers of a network just to approximate whatever a single neuron does in the brain. Yeah, I feel like that fact is underexplored, and when people think of neurons, they automatically think of neurons in machine learning terms of, like a single neuron basically is very, very simple, right?
Right.
Yeah, but it turns out they're way more complex.
Wow, I just learned something too. I thought, yeah, I've always, well, the idea of like neuron firing or not firing, it's like a bit flips, or hearing that comparison made. And so I've always thought that they were kind of individually not doing very much. But you're saying that there's actually much more layered to each individual neuron.
Yeah, in the brain for sure.
Okay, cool. Yeah, you have to explore. Do you remember which video it was?
Yeah, I think I don't remember the exact title, but it's like on dendritic computations, and you can probably leave a link in the description.
Yeah, I'll leave the links in the description. After the fact, I go through and I make sure that that's all in there. So that's very cool. And what about so going back to you personally, what are your long-term research goals?
If you asked me this question maybe like 6 months or a year ago, I would have a very concrete answer to you. Like, I would say that I was really sold on the idea of hippocampal computations and, sort of investigating hippocampus as this general purpose cognitive mapping machine, right? And how it interacts with the cortex, how it encodes and processes information. But today, I feel like I'm still, going back and forth, diving more into the world of machine learning. So, for example, in the lab that I joined officially just a few weeks ago, and we can talk about it more. But the rotation project that I was doing in the lab, and I'm still continuing to do, is about language models, actually, like the hidden representations inside a transformer. So yeah, I'm still exploring different directions, both in terms of computational neuroscience, so like analysis of experimental data, and more sort of topics that are usually studied by machine learning, like transformer networks or diffusion models. But very broadly, I would say I'm really interested in the geometry of hidden representations and how those hidden representations, right, whatever the way information is encoded in the network, right, be it a brain or a language model, it has to have some structure in its kind of latent space, how the variables are encoded, and how that structure supports all of the computational complexity that the system carries out. So yeah, I'd say I'm really interested in this transformation, like how the geometry of information, information storage, right, inside a system supports the computational dynamics.
Interesting. It's great. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's where we're going to head to next. Sort of the geometries, topologies. So many of your videos, which are excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
Especially the visual, the presentation is just wonderful, and is like the level of like 3 blue, 1 brown, which I'm sure is like not a mentor, but is like is a model for you to sort of emulate and be.
I drew a lot of inspiration from Grant, and in the earlier videos, I relied extensively on the library that he wrote. Very, very impressive. It's called Manium, so like mathematical animations. Basically, it's a Python library to do these. If you're doing mathematical animations that need to be very, very precise, right? And then it's a wonderful tool.
Cool. Well, we'll talk more about your channel later. I do want to talk about your creative. But just one quick question: how long does it take you to do, say, an average video from start to finish?
I would say, it depends on how many hours per day I put into it. So while I was in undergraduate, I could dedicate a lot more time. And so I could do one video per month. At least I had a chunk of, like I had a period of like over the course of a few months where I was focusing a lot on YouTube. And I could create, I think I did like 4 or 5 videos with an interval of 1 month. But that's if I dedicate about 5 or 6 hours per day, every day.
Wow.
Then it's about a month.
Oof, that is a lot of time. Jesus.
But if you look at the interval,
It pays off, yeah.
If you look at the gap of time between my recent video, as of today, it is backpropagation that I published a few months ago. And the video that was done before that, I think it is the span of like 6 months. So I worked on the backprop video for 6 months, but this is because I was moving to US, starting the PhD. So I was like kind of working on it haphazardly.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I know that. I've been there before. Okay, great. So let's go back to geometries, because we'll talk about YouTube a little bit later. But something you said a few minutes ago when you brought up the topic, that something about the geometry supporting the computation. It would seem to me that the computation, correct me if I'm wrong, the computation dictates the geometry, or is it the other way around? Is it sort of, do I have that directionally wrong?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say what exactly the direction is, right? Because, it is true that if you have a computational goal in mind, for example, if you are a deep neural network that recognizes images, right? And let's say you're a network that classifies whether there is a dog or a cat on the image, then you need to somehow transform the numerical representation of the image from the pixel space, right? So just the array of 100 by 100, or let's say even more, just pixels, into a decision, right? You need to output whether it's a cat or a dog. And so somehow you need to turn one array of numbers into another, right? And the surprising thing is that, if you look at the network, right, it sort of does a lot of computations sequentially, right? It gradually transforms the representation, right, from pixel space to like a more compressed representation, right? And so if you, for example, consider the space of images, right? You have all images of dogs, right? And one image, let's just say for simplicity, it's like 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, right? That's rather a larger image, but there are networks that could do it. Then if it's 1,000 by 1,000, it means that there is 1 million numbers, right, that are encoding this image. And let's just discard all of the 3 color channels. Let's say it's a binary image, right? So 1 million numbers. Then each image can be thought of as a point in a 1,000,000 dimensional space, right? Where if you have 1,000,000 coordinates, then you simply you kind of use the value of each pixel as a coordinate along the corresponding axes, right? So you get, for each image, you get a point in a 1,000,000 dimensional space. And now you consider, let's say, a whole bunch of images of dogs, right? In pixel space, they're all very different. So you'll have a cloud of points in a 1,000,000 dimensional space that are kind of all over the place. And then you consider the images of cats. Same thing, right? They're all different in the raw pixel space. And so in this 1,000,000 dimensional space, right, the cloud of points is kind of everywhere with no apparent structure. But then if you have a network that was trained, and we could talk about more how it is trained, but let's say somebody gives you the network, right, that does this image recognition. And what it needs to do is to basically map each point from this million-dimensional space, right, from pixels, into a decision, whether it's a cat or a dog. And so if you think about it, then all of these point clouds for cats and dogs that are initially very intertwined, right? Points are scattered all over the place. The network needs to warp this space just right to separate all the cats from all the dogs, right? And then, you can like just classify or like have a linear readout at the final layer that actually makes a decision, right? If it's a cat or a dog. But the thing is, how do you warp this space, right? Because if you imagine all the computations that a network does, a lot of it is linear, right? So it's like kind of just rotating and scaling all the space at once, right? But you cannot go very far if you only have linear operations. We have to have some nonlinearities. And what these nonlinearities that are in between the layers, what they do is they kind of warp the space, right? If you think about ReLU, right, then you leave one part of space. You kind of zero out the negatives and then leave positive values as is. So basically, there is a lot of ways how you can massage the space and just warp it, kind of like a piece of rubber, right, with all the nonlinearities. And then this warping needs to be just right to separate the two classes. But if you have a different task, a different computation in mind, right, let's say an image predicts whether an animal is present on the image or not, right, then the same point clouds, but it needs to warp the space differently to kind of compress all the cats and all the dogs into like a single cluster that corresponds to, an animal, right? But let's say images of cars that, again, in the pixel space, they are all over the place as well, right? They're mixed in, kind of sprinkled between the cats and dogs, and it's very hard to disentangle. Right, but you need to warp the space to kind of map all the points for cars to a different cluster so that you can make a decision. And you can see how, depending on the task, right, that you want the network to perform, it needs to carry out different computations and do different transformations to this space. And what I'm really interested in is, what is the optimal geometry? Like, how can we describe what these intermediate stages of warping are, right? Because it clearly is doing something meaningful, like in terms of geometry, right? But it's still a very hard problem to understand what's going on at the each intermediate layer.
Sure. Are there any patterns or meta patterns that you found in terms of like geometries that pop up regularly?
So I haven't looked at, what I mentioned about cats and dogs. This is just like a toy example. To illustrate what the network has to do under the hood.
Yeah.
Right. But we're still kind of thinking of how do you describe geometry, right? Especially given that you only have a finite sample, right? You have only a handful of points, right? It's not like you have the equation for the surface and then you can track how it warps, right? That would be great, but yeah. And so what I'm doing in the lab right now, and I should mention that I work in the geometric data analysis and neuro AI lab at Flatiron Institute and NYU, led by Dr. Suyon Chung. And what I'm doing with language models and what the entire lab is doing, like in different directions, right? There are people who are working on the theory side of things.
Sure.
All right, there are people who are working with experimental data, with other deep learning architectures. Is to how do you describe what geometry is optimal for what task? And what we're mainly talking about is the notion of linear separability. It's exactly like what I described. So, if you have cats and dogs, right, you need to separate them, right? And we refer to these like clouds of points as manifolds, right? That are like kind of a subspace of the ambient space on which all of the cat images live, for example, right? Then these manifolds, they need to be transformed to be linearly separable, and that how separable they are depends a lot on the dimensionality of that representation, right? So, for example, you can imagine that separating two flat two-dimensional surfaces, right, is generally easier than separating like some curved, curved surfaces. It also depends on things like radius, like alignment, like axis correlation between them. So there's a lot of geometric measures that determine how suitable that representation is for linear separability.
Gotcha. Have you always been interested in geometry? I mean, like within the field, it's a big field, neuroscience. I mean, how much of the attention, how much of the research is on geometry? It must be a small percentage, like 1%, 2%. It must be small, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I really like, because I tend to think in pictures, and
Sure.
like I cannot, understand something if I don't have a picture. And so I'm kind of like subconsciously like driven to just imagining all of these like non-linear transformations, not so much as like mathematical functions, right, which they obviously are, but I kind of just envisioned all of like warping and like sort of tilting and rotating of the space. But at the same time, as of right now, and it's been kind of my goal, but I don't have a rigorous background in geometry, and in fact, I hated geometry during high school. Like I couldn't really like sort of, especially these like three-dimensional, what is like stereometry, I think it's called in English, right? Where you have different problem sets with like pyramids and cubes and there are all of these theorems, right? That like I can't even remember them, but
Sure.
I always struggled with geometry in terms of like proving stuff with conventional geometric way, right? But I'm gradually trying to kind of get more and more solid understanding of the mathematical side of things, right? To be more rigorous. But as of right now, I just think in pictures in terms of like transformations of the space. Yeah,
Sure.
But it doesn't have a mathematical underpinning.
Gotcha. And can you give us any examples of how, I guess, task-relevant geometries are used in the brain to perform specific functions? Like anything that you can share with us?
So it's hard to reason about the brain, right? Because we don't have, well, first of all, we don't have a lot of data, right? Sort of just to really, study the representations that are in the brain in the same way that we could do in deep nets, for example, right? Where you have access to every neuron, right? To every weight. You can do all sorts of perturbations, right? You can sample, a bunch of points with, arbitrary accuracy, right? You can always like map synthetic data to study what's going on inside the network. But with the brain, we're very limited in terms of how many neurons you record, how many like stimuli, right? You can, for example, if you're running an experiment, you're presenting some images to a monkey, right? And you're recording from its brain, right? There's only so many, images you can show in an experiment, right? And another problem is, and I think this is actually a more important point, that we don't really know what the task of the brain is, right? What is the computational objective? Like when we are training an image classification network, right? We're exactly optimizing it to, put an image into one of like 1,000 classes for an ImageNet, for example, something like that, right? It has a well-defined objective function that it is optimized for, and then we can say, okay, this geometry, right, it sort of supports, this objective. Like if you want to classify images, you need to kind of map your messy representation in the pixel space to something that would be separable, right, to something that would support this kind of classification objective. And people are trying to map, there's a whole line of work that are trying to map the activations in an image network, right, that is trained for object classification, right, to kind of map that activity to actual experimental activity in different areas of visual cortex, right, and see how well you can reconstruct, activity of biological neurons from a monkey brain, from different networks. But I've always, I don't know, I've never been quite a fan of this approach because, the objective of the brain is not, object classification, right? So it's kind of whatever representations are there, right? They are suited for something different. And so, yes, you could, reconstruct activations in area IT, for example, that in the brain is thought to be responsible for things like object classification, right, from different machine learning models, right? And it's very, very impressive line of work, technically, right? From experiments to training the networks to constructing this mapping. But I have serious doubts of how insightful for the brain that is, right? The fact that you can match some of the activities if your objective functions are different. And so, because this was kind of a long answer to your question because we don't really know concretely what the task of the brain is, and so it's hard to reason, well, what geometry would support this task, because we don't know what that is.
Right.
But we could try do it the other way around, right? We can try look at the geometry that is in the brain, right? And then think about, well, okay, what task would be, best kind of supported by that geometry.
Gotcha. And I'm guessing that an objective, say, maximizing fitness, is too broad. Right? You probably can't do enough with that.
Yeah, I mean, we could sort of, construct different hypotheses. What the objective function of the brain might be, and I'm personally convinced that it's probably something along the lines of predicting the next sensory observation, right? That is kind of getting into predictive coding idea, and that if you're, like you said, if you want to maximize fitness, right? If you want to maximize, the probability of transmitting your genes, right? That's sort of the evolutionary pressure, right? And then that's a very high level objective. But then you can think that you can imagine that if you want to reach that objective, right? You need to kind of act on the environment, right, to maximize the chances that you will survive and reproduce and pass your genes downwards, right? And in order to select appropriate actions to act on the environment, you need a mechanism to kind of run sort of like mental simulations in your head, and to predict what the consequences of each action might be, right, in order to select the optimal one, right? Because you can't really test different actions by trying, right? It's like how when you are driving a car, right, and you're kind of on the edge of the cliff, and then you can't really test, well, let's see what happens if I drive off the cliff, right? Maybe it's the best strategy, right? Because you'll die and that's it, right? You'll need to like have a generative predictive model in the brain that will tell you that driving off the cliff is not a good idea, without actually doing it in the real environment, right? And so you need this kind of predictive component to at least approximate, okay, what the consequences of each action might be.
Right.
And that kind of can formalize it as predicting, what is the next incoming sensory observation, like what I might see, right? What might the readout of my sensors be if I do this, right? And sort of, that's kind of getting to the point that one of the objectives of the brain is probably to always predict one sort of time step, right, into the future, to predict its sensory evidence a few time steps down the line.
Interesting. We'll have to go back to just the geometric thing.
Yeah, sure.
What kind of insights can a geometric analysis of the brain provide that other analysis types can't do? Like, what are the pros and cons of looking at it that way?
I would say one of the biggest advantages is you are looking at the population activity of neurons at once. Right? And just to be clear, when we're talking about geometry, I'm kind of referring it to in a broad sense, right?
Topology as well. I mean,
all of the population level analysis, right? You're looking at what the collective behavior of neurons might be doing, what information it might be encoding, rather than, for example, looking at each neuron like one by one. Right, and you can imagine if your information code is distributed across many neurons, then you need all of them. You need the sort of population dynamics to give you the complete picture. While if you're just looking at individual neurons, right, then you're basically not seeing it depends on the task, but generally, individual neurons tell you very little, right, about how information might be encoded, right? Because after all, they are sort of interconnected, right, into a single network, and so each of them is sort of contributing only one, if you think about it as the high dimensional space, right, then you're kind of reading out only one coordinate, right?
Right. It's not very useful. It's just a light turning on and off. if you just like to look at one thing on its own.
And it's been shown in a lot of studies that, let's say you're recording brain activity of the animal, as it is running in a maze, right? And sure, there are examples of place cells, right, that I also talk about in quite a few videos, actually, because that was one of my initial interests in the hippocampus. And there are indeed neurons, right, that would fire, when the animal is in a particular patch, the particular region of the environment, right? And then you would look at that neuron and see, wow, that's a beautiful positional code, right? But in reality, if you actually grab a mouse, record from neurons in its hippocampus, right? Yes, activity of neurons will be very closely related to where the animal is in space. So there will be some positional code. But you will very rarely see neurons that look like these textbook place cells with one peak, right? Instead, their activity is kind of all over the place in the environment, right? Oftentimes they have 2 or 3 or 4 different place cells, right? Place fields. They remap in unpredictable ways, right? If you put an animal into a different environment, right, then the positional code will be different. And so there is a lot of ambiguity. If you're looking at a single neuron, if you're looking at its response as a function of position, the only thing you can say is that, well, okay, it has something to do with position, probably, right? But there is not a lot of structure in this code. But if you take all of these neurons that have very, sort of unclear place field profiles, right? And if you consider the population activity all at once, right? If you just take 300 neurons, for example, I mean, you can't directly visualize it, right? But if you think about them as points in a high-dimensional space, right? Like if you have 300 neurons, that's 300 coordinates, right? You can't see it, but if you then apply some techniques to reduce the dimensionality, and there are algorithms that try to find the representation of that cloud of points in a 3-dimensional space that you can see that captures the same topology, right? Yeah, there are different sort of kind of different metrics, what they're trying to capture. Either it's topology of the entire cloud of points, or whether it's pairwise distances, right? But essentially, you can reduce the dimension to visualize that structure. And when you look at it, you oftentimes see a very elegant representation, right? You can color your points by spatial coordinate, right? And you can see that activity reflects your position in a meaningful way, right? Or if you have some sort of other complicated task that even includes a non-spatial dimension, right? That, for example, when the animal has to run through the maze and count towers, right, on left and right side, right? And you can sort of see that internal counting variable also being very prominently reflected in that population activity structure. So that geometry at the same time encodes multiple variables, right? And you just don't have access to it when you look at one neuron, or even just a handful of neurons.
Sure. Oh, so it's fascinating stuff. And you'd mentioned earlier about your early work on theta rhythms, and you have a great video on theta rhythms. I think it's a memory clock. That's what it is. The wavelets stuff. Are you familiar at all with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's flow state concept?
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah. I was wondering if, that's something I could have looked up as well, but if you have any insight as to the brainwave state of a brain, of someone in a flow state, in an activity where they're on sort of the edge, they're properly, they have the proper skills to attain it, but it's challenging enough. And do you have any insights as to brainwave states there?
I'm not familiar with any sort of literature. I'm sure there are, but I just don't work with humans. I don't. Yeah, I don't want to make something up and say it on the podcast.
No, please do.
Yeah, I mean, but
I'll hold you to it later.
Okay.
Just kidding.
If I were to just think about what might be happening,
please.
It's probably not true, but it's at least my initial idea that when you're in the flow state, right? I mean, it depends on what you're doing, but like if you're, I would say something along the lines of like the enhancement of gamma rhythms, right? Or like, these like cortical rhythms that are are observed when you are solving a particular task, right? That when you're actively engaged, when you're like solving a math problem, for example, right? And it's a general trend that you will transition to like higher frequency waves, right? Because if you think about brain rhythms, right, and like what these brain waves are when we're recording them, it's basically a large population of neurons that is discharging almost synchronously, right? And because they are all spiking at the same time, then you can kind of pick up that activity from the outside of the brain. And in general, like slower waves, states that are characterized by slower wave activity, right? Things like delta waves, for example. They are very high amplitude, and I should say that the amplitude of the wave is related to its frequency, right? So the slower your frequency is, the higher the amplitude. So for example, delta waves that are really slow, right? But they're really high in amplitude. And so if you think about what happens in the brain when you're observing this, it's a whole bunch of neurons lighting up, like spiking simultaneously, right? So kind of a lot of them are synchronized, and like it's not, I shouldn't say it's not doing any interesting computation, right? But it's like sort of, I mean, if everything is in sync, right, then you're not really representing any information, right? If you were to imagine that all of the neurons in the brain just going up and down and up and down, right? You're not really encoding anything.
Okay, gotcha.
Right. And so, for example, if you look at motor cortex, right? If you record the activity, just the EEG above the motor cortex, let's say, the region that corresponds to like your right arm, right? Then when your right arm is at rest, you will see like slower frequency, mu waves in that cortex, in that patch of cortex, right? So it kind of corresponds to like the inactive state. But as soon as you begin to actually move your arm, that mu wave disappears. So it's kind of desynchronization is observed, right? So because you're actively engaging that area of cortex, that slower wave rhythm disappears, right? Because it kind of reflects like the resting state, right? While you're not doing anything, the neurons are just like kind of oscillating synchronously. But when you need them to perform any meaningful computation, like sort of how to move your arm, right? Then they start to like encode different aspects of that movement, and so the synchronization disappears. And so, and similarly, alpha rhythm that is in the occipital lobe, right? It's a slower wave oscillation that is observed when your eyes are closed, but when your eyes are open, so there is actually salient visual information that your occipital cortex receives, that rhythm disappears, right? It switches to a different kind of mode when it has to perform like intricate computations, right? So I would say when you're in the flow state, coming back to your question, right? I would expect that some like the balance of frequencies changes, right? In a way, but Yeah, could be like gamma rhythm enhancing, but again, when you're in the flow state, you're not, right? Because flow feels different, right? What's the definition of the flow state? It's like something when you're not, like you are absorbed in the problem, right? But you're not actively struggling through it, right? It just kind of flows effortlessly, right? And that part of the definition might suggest that there could be, in fact, a transition to like slower waves, right? You're in a sense like more on autopilot. So I mean, that's just a long ramble to kind of say that I don't really know what's happening at the flow state.
But it's still interesting to hear your, these kind of tidbits of information that come through, because as you point out, like, I don't know, if you ask me intuitively, you were to say something to the degree, okay, let's say all your brain waves were synchronous and they were kind of flowing, they were in rhythm together. I would kind of say intuitively, oh, that sounds like a good thing. I don't know. Everything is kind of working in concert. But it's more, that would be more like if you're listening to music and it was just like one tone or one note the entire time. That's not interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Everything is good, like in sort of the optimal degree, right? For example, since you mentioned like music and whether it's interesting or not, right? If you think about, right, and I think, this is what Yuri Buzhaki talks about in, I think it was in one of his interviews, but it may be in the book as well. It's basically the idea that we enjoy music because it's sort of halfway between being predictable and being unpredictable, right? I mean, and like the two extreme examples, you can imagine that if you just have one tone or like one beat that sort of is repeated with a constant frequency, then you can predict what's going on at like to arbitrarily high, like, long into the future, right? You can basically predict everything. And so that's not interesting because you just know what's going to happen. But on the other end of the spectrum, right, white noise, for example, is basically the most unpredictable stimulus you can think of, right? It's just noise. You have no idea what's going to happen like the next second or like half a second. And that's not really enjoyable either. I mean, not in the music enjoyable kind of sense, right? You can listen to white noise when you're working to kind of distract yourself, but that's a different thing, right? But with music, you can kind of predict what's going to happen, like a few kind of like like a few notes, right, down the melody, but you can't go further than that in terms of your prediction, right? And sort of the fact that it's like almost predictable, but only a little bit, is what makes it enjoyable.
Right. Yeah. I got to pick up this book. I would love to learn more about this.
It may be actually in another book of Yuri. It's called Rhythms of the Brain. It's a bit older. I don't want to lie, but it may be like 2006 or something, like along the like in that range.
Yeah.
It's a bit more technical, I'd say. So it's more neuroscience. Like it has a lot of details from neuroscience, right? So like a lot of nitty-gritty of like sort of physiology and like brain rhythms. Since you are interested in that, I think you would enjoy it.
Yeah, I definitely am. And we have a video on, I can't remember, I watched it a long time ago, on, I think it was doing it with mice, how they were mapping a space along a torus.
Oh yeah.
Can you expand on, like, tell us something?
Yeah, so that is also related to the geometry, and that video was about grid cells. So just a bit of background. Grid cells are neurons in the entorhinal cortex, which is an area of the brain that kind of feeds into the hippocampus, right? And so when people like started studying these like place cells, right, and the positional code in the hippocampus, they thought, well, okay, something has to be driving those neurons in the spatially selective kind of way. So what will happen if we look at like one area before, like prior to the hippocampus, right, that sends its inputs there? And in the entorhinal cortex, there are neurons that are also selective to physical location in space. But unlike textbook examples of place cells that have like only one peak, right, or like selective to a particular area of space, grid cells kind of, in terms of their preference, each cell tiles the space in this hexagonal grid-like pattern. So it fires in multiple locations in the environment, arranged like as a grid. So it's kind of forming as if like a coordinate system, but not a conventional Cartesian coordinate, more like a grid sort of coordinates, right? But then again, if you're recording from a single grid cell, and you're observing that it is firing, you can't really say where the animal is located, right? Because it's firing in all of the like nodes of that lattice, right? There's a lot of places where it fires. And so if you want to uniquely decode the spatial location, you need responses from multiple grid cells, actually, that have like different sizes, different spatial frequencies of the grid, right? Then depending on the overlap pattern which cells fire, you can kind of like pinpoint where all of those different grids overlap, like in a unique location. And the video was focused on the idea that if you look at the population activity of all of those grid cells, and it's been predicted before using computational models, but basically if you have these grid-like representations, then your population activity has to form a toroidal structure, and it has to do with like the fact that your grid is basically symmetric, right? I don't want to go into detail about like why it's a torus. The main reason behind it is I don't understand it either. I mean, like mathematically, right?
Yeah,
I just know that mathematically speaking, when you have a grid response, like grid kind of responses like that, if you consider all of them, like you have to have some toroidal topology of those responses, right, in the high-dimensional space, due to those symmetries precisely. And it's been predicted like in computational models, but it was like unknown whether something like that is observed in the brain. And when that paper was published, I think what it was like 2021 or like 2020, I don't really remember exactly at this point, but it's a paper from the Mosers group in Norway, and indeed they found that this toroidal structure is present in real brains, right? So the grid cells kind of form this torus in their activation space. But what I think the main insight from this paper, and why it was surprising, is that basically this torus is driven internally. So for example, let's say you have neurons that are indeed selective to space in this kind of symmetrical way, right? Then as the animal runs around in a maze, you record from those neurons that they form a grid, right? And the reason why you can do it is because you know exactly where the animal is, right? And you can basically compute like the firing map you can compute for each neuron where in space it prefers to fire, right? And you'll see those grids, right? Then when you look at the population activity, grids form a torus. That is expected. That is almost non-surprising, right? Because we've known before that responses of grid-like responses have to form a torus, right, mathematically. But the real cool nugget here is that if you now look at what the activity of the network of grid cells is doing when the animal is asleep, right? Because it is sleeping, right? Some grid cells like fire, right? You can still record, cells, but you don't have the positional information anymore, right? Because the animal is just lying in one, right? It's sleeping, so you cannot construct a firing map, right? You cannot say that a single grid cell is like still fires in a hexagonal pattern because there is no positional information anymore, right? You can't compute a firing map. But what you can do is see what the collective behavior of that network is, right? Without necessarily tying it to position. And you can see that the torus still persists. So that grid cell, that like symmetric pattern of activity is probably generated internally, right? And it still persists during sleep. And you can think of it as if, although that's a simplification, but conceptually, it's as if the mouse is dreaming, right? And it's dreaming of some space. And in that space, right, there is some virtual position, right, as it kind of runs around in its dream, right? And those grid cells, they are still responding in these hexagonal patterns, but in this kind of virtual position, right, in the imagined space. And obviously you cannot see it on the level of individual neurons, right, because you don't have access to whatever the internal variable is, right, what's the virtual position, right? You can't look into the mouse's head and see what it is dreaming about. But the fact that the activity is still constrained to lie on the same torus, right, if you consider all the cells at once, still suggests that there is some persistent grid-like symmetric activity, right? The population code is still there when there are no external positional inputs, right? And this is why what I think is often missed. Like when people talk about this paper, they would be like, oh, like we've known for 20 years that if you have grid-like responses, they form a torus, right? That's almost like for people who are doing grid cells, that's a trivial fact. For all the rest, like me, yeah, that's still not as intuitively clear, but yeah. But the fact that it's still preserved in during sleep is, to me at least, very surprising.
That's very interesting. Oh my gosh, so much stuff to look into and discover after this conversation. The free energy principle. But can you speak to anything in Friston's work that's called out to you, or I know it's sort of potentially something you might cover on your channel going forward. But where are you now, sort of, with the free energy principle and what you understand about it?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit spoiler alert. I was actually scripting a video on free energy, right? But then I realized there is so much to cover. Like if I wanted to cover all of the prerequisites, right, to kind of give a very intuitive and like understandable, explanation of what it is, I would have to cover a lot of background concepts, starting with like KL divergence, for example, right? How you measure the discrepancy between two probability distributions, right? And only that, just back of the envelope calculation would be, just to explain it properly, that would take like 10, 15 minutes, maybe, right?
Right.
And if you have all of like a lot of those concepts, then I would get to actual free energy by like 2 or 3 hour mark in the video. Yeah, and that's like just too infeasible to just pack everything into one video. And so I decided to kind of spread out. And yeah, I'm working on like the background prerequisite videos right now, but eventually, yeah, I want to get to the to free energy principle. And I'm still doing my, as you said, there's a lot of research load. I'm still reading, a lot of his papers, and the recent Active Inference book that was published last year, maybe like not too long ago. Just to get a grasp, because it is notoriously very hard to understand. Like I've talked I've talked to quite a few people, like in my neuroscience, in the neuroscience community, right? And yeah, a lot of people seem to, they say, "Oh yeah, that's cool. I don't really understand it."
Yeah.
But yeah, and I've had multiple attempts to get over it, like starting from maybe 3 years ago. Yeah, but I always like gave up.
Yeah.
Now I figured it's time, and honestly, I feel like I'm starting to get the first broad strokes, and I'm really beginning to resonate with it. I feel like it's a very insightful idea, and yeah, we could talk a bit more about it. And so, just is a very, very general overview, right? What it is saying is, and it's kind of getting back to your question about what is the objective function for the brain, right? And we talked a little bit about how it is probably predicting, right? It's like a predictive machine. And this is, in fact, what like free energy principle is saying. I mean, there's way a lot more to free energy principle rather than just that, but it's one of the key ideas behind the framework, that the brain is constantly trying to predict the next incoming sensory evidence. And the objective function is to minimize the discrepancy between what the brain is predicting, right, and the actual sensory evidence that it is receiving. And if you want to minimize the discrepancy between prediction and actual sensory data, right, there are two things that you can do. First of all, you can change your prediction, right? So, for example, if I predict that, let's say I have a belief that when I open the fridge, there will be an elephant inside the fridge, right? That's my strong belief. Now, when I open the fridge, I do not see an elephant in there. That creates a mismatch between what I predicted and, what I observed, right? And so to minimize that prediction, I can change my assumptions about the world, right? I can change my prediction and say, well, okay, noted, elephants probably do not live in fridges, right? That's my updated belief about the world. And this is what people usually think of, when we're like talking about all the self-supervised learning paradigms in machine learning, right? That if you have a network that is trying to predict something, right? It could be either predict the next frame in the video, or in language models, it could be like predict the next word in a sequence. Then if you observe an error, right, that you predict one word while the correct answer is a different one, right, then you update the parameters of the network, right? You change the prediction to be more aligned with what you observe. Now, the key aspect, and this is what's lacking in machine learning in almost all subfields of machine learning, is there is a different trajectory, right? If you want to minimize the prediction if you want to minimize the discrepancy between prediction and evidence, one thing is to change the prediction, but another strategy is to just change the evidence. And I've always, I didn't really understood it before. I was like, well, what does it mean to change the evidence? Like, I cannot just suddenly see the elephant, right, in the fridge, right? That's just kind of weird. I can't generate new sensory data. But what free energy principle and active inference, that's a related term, what the framework is telling us is that agents typically have the ability to act on the world, and when they have sensors that they use to kind of sample different sensory data from the environment, they have active control on how to position the sensors, so to speak, right? You can move them around to actually change what you see, what you observe. And one example where that second strategy to minimizing the discrepancy is employed, and I haven't at all thought about this that way, but when you consider homeostasis, for example, right? So physiologically, there are a lot of vital parameters that you need to keep within a certain range to survive, right? Like the body temperature or level of glucose. And so I think, it's the example that is probably in the book, that if you consider body temperature and regulating your body temperature as through the lens of active inference, then what it is saying is you have a very strong belief, right? You have a prediction what your body temperature is, right? And that is you predict my body temperature is 36.6 degrees Celsius, right? That's a normal value. Or let's say not even internal body temperature, but just the outside temperature, right? For example, you have the belief how hot or cold you should feel, and then let's say you observe sensory evidence that is not aligned with this prediction. For example, it's super hot outside, right? And your receptors on the skin, right? They tell your brain that the actual sensory data that you observe, is of different value, right? It is hotter compared to your prediction. Now, one thing you could do is, as we said, change the prediction and just gaslight yourself as saying, oh no, now my new assumption is that my body, my temperature should be this, right? This is normal, right? I mean, you can convince yourself that way, and it will indeed minimize the divergence between, or the discrepancy between the prediction and evidence. While on the other hand, you can, move to a cooler place, right? You can actively select what observations you are collecting, right? You can reposition your sensors just by, literally walking to like an air-conditioned room, for example. That way, because you've changed your sensory observations so that they are more aligned with your prediction. All right, and similar arguments could be made with, like, you have an expectation what the level of glucose should be, or you're predicting what the level of glucose is, and if you observe something different from that level, right, you go ahead and like get some food or do something that will actually change the incoming sensory data, right? But it's kind of like just a conceptual reframing of the problem that, if you're doing, like, when people think about homeostasis, right, they don't think about it in terms of prediction, right? It's like,
Right.
you have some goal, right? Or you have the goal to keep the body temperature in a certain range, right? Or to be, to have a certain level of sugar, right, in the bloodstream. And then you act to achieve that goal. But what active inference is saying is there is no really such thing as a goal. What you have is a prediction on the incoming sensory data, right? And you are just acting on the world to collect new data that would be more aligned with your prediction, right? So the end result is the same, but it's how you think about the problem computationally, right? Otherwise, you'd have to like separate. Okay, well, there is homeostasis. When there are like higher level like cognitive goals, right? Then there are like psychology and emotion, like all this stuff, right? And it's like very complex. But what I really like about active inference is there is literally, in this view at least, it's literally just one objective function. Right? You want to minimize the discrepancy between prediction and evidence, and then all of those aspects, you can kind of reframe them conceptually in that framework, right?
Right. One thing that, and I understand
The basic idea, and I think I may have even asked him this when I interviewed him, but when a system gets to a point where there's no more, let's say there's no discrepancy at all between the prediction and what's actually being presented, that would seem to be optimal, but also it doesn't.
in a sense to me, and I think Friston said this as well, where that's not quite optimal. Like
Zero, like,
do you see what I mean? Like you could,
I think it's called the dark room fallacy or something like that, or
the dark room
paradox, something like that.
You can lock yourself in a
dark room and have no difference between the prediction and what's actually being presented. But that doesn't seem optimal either. Is this?
Yeah, I love the idea of dark room paradox, and it took me a while to like think about how to resolve it. And it's funny, like, I'm not sure if that would be Friston's answer.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, but
put words on his mouth.
I've had a conversation about this problem, actually, with Anthropic's Claude 3 Opus language model.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, it's one thing that I'm getting into is like using these language models as like kind of assistance to like promote my own thinking. I would like kind of ask it question, and it would like give me some answer, and I would read it, and I would like, okay, this makes sense, this doesn't. Like, can you explain this more, right? And just to see what it can say, right? And Claude came up with a really good explanation of the dark room problem, which I think makes sense. I'm not sure if this is what Friston intended or not, but so it goes like this. So it is true that if you lock yourself in the dark room, there will be no immediate discrepancy, right? But you can imagine that you kind of know that there is an outside, even if you look yourself in a room, there still remains an outside world, right? And if you just sit there, there are a lot of things that can happen in the outside world, right? That can disrupt it, right? You know, it could be that a giant monster like breaks into the dark room, right? That would be a very unexpected event. And so if you want to minimize your discrepancy, like if you want to predict your sensory evidence, not just right now, but you know, further down the line, right? Sort of in the long shot, right? If you want to be more or less, you know, if you want to minimize the discrepancy, you know, along the long time course, right? Like the expected discrepancy, for example, right? Then the optimal strategy is to actually get out of the dark room and explore the world and like sample, so deliberately immerse yourself into pockets of uncertainty in order to resolve that uncertainty right now, so that in the future, right, it doesn't come after you. In the sense that, you know, if you're not exploring it, you don't really know what is happening in the outside world, and so you cannot really make predictions about it. It's like you have to first explore in order to, you know, to minimize the uncertainty further down the line. Yeah. It's like you're kind of trading off some prediction error right now in order to explore, but then, you know, you will have a better knowledge of the world that you can utilize in order to minimize the discrepancy further down the line, right?
Sure, right.
It's like how in video games when you have a map, right, and initially it's like underexplored, right, and then like it's kind of, if you want to be as certain about the world as possible, right, to minimize potential uncertainty, you can just stay where you are and like not explore the map, but then you don't know like what's like, if there is a giant tornado like outside the map that you don't see, right, and you cannot predict it. And so in a way, the best strategy to be as certain about the world as possible is to explore the entire map, right? You will be faced with immediate discrepancy, right, as you are doing this exploration, right? But after you're kind of done, then, you know, you've cleared out all possible sources of uncertainty, right? Of course, in the real outside world, you cannot explore, like it's infinite. The amount of uncertainty is infinite, right? You can't really know anything, right? So that you could predict anything, right? So that map is kind of infinite, but the best way for you is to explore as much of it as possible, essentially.
Interesting. I like that workaround. It brings to the forefront this idea of like a time horizon. Like what are you optimizing for? How long? You know, for how much of a life or life expectancy, let's say.
And then there's also, oh shoot, I just had it. What was it? It reminds me of the, are you familiar with the explore-exploit trade-off? Foraging strategy. So it's kind of related to that or similar to that in a sense that you can exploit. Exploitation would be, to make the analogy, the lower minimization, the surprisal minimization. But then there's always some amount of exploration that's needed to optimize, because you never know how good, you know, a few miles away there could be an even better, say, foraging spot. And it kind of relates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. It's very, very related to it. And I really like I feel like it's one of the hardest problems right now in like the field of machine learning, right, and reinforcement learning. And I plan to, at some point, you know, in my research, kind of get into that active inference framework and like actually see, you know, if you build AI agents or like AI models that have the ability to act have the ability to change the sensory observations, right?
Yeah.
Because that's like a second branch that we're missing, right? It's not clear right now how like, I mean, it kind of makes sense that if you just imagine, if you could literally build like a virtual environment, like simulate all the sensors and make it like kind of like a reinforcement learning agents, right? We have these like environments for many years now. But for example, for the case of language models that are trained to predict the next token, it's not clear how you would incorporate that active inference idea. It would be that your language models would have to have the ability to sample the text, right? It's like you're not feeding them, the entire text of Wikipedia to predict. But I mean, you're kind of doing that, but at the same time, you're giving them some sort of control to like go to different articles of that, like explicitly go to different parts of the data set, right? That's it's not clear how that would work for language models, for example. But and once you have that, once you have that agent, right, that has a generative model that creates the predictions and has the ability to act, right? Then how do you decide what to do in each situation? Like, how do you choose between whether to update the prediction or go and act, right?
Yeah,
that's a trade-off that I think is still like is one of the major challenges in like trying to incorporate active inference into actual AI models. Is like how do you solve that how do you choose what to do, right?
Yeah, it seems like related to, this just reminds me of this general question of, maybe you've heard this, or maybe it was a YouTube video I watched a long time ago, but it was like, okay, let's say you have to choose between two restaurants, and one's a place you've been to a million times and you love it, it's good, it's an 8 out of 10, let's say, and then there's a restaurant B, which is a wild card, never been there before, you don't know, could be great, could be terrible, and how you decide is really how much time you have like left in that city, let's say. You've heard this before, this is not new to you, I'm sure. And if you only have one night left, let's say, you should go to the tried and true place. If you're gonna live in that city for years, or, how much time you have left, then you should try out the second option, because it might be better than the first place, right? And so when you talk about, say, an AI or a system that's sampling, it seems like it needs to know sort of how much time it has, like its total available scope, let's say. It kind of needs to know, it needs to start with the end in mind, in a way. Does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah. That's an interesting example.
Sort of, yeah. The time horizon, I think that when you brought up the dark room and the world outside of it, what seems to me keeps coming back is like the expected amount of either information that can be the system will have access to or can potentially have access to, or like the time that we have left in order to make decisions.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I'm not sure how to like incorporate that formally, right?
For sure.
And another thing that has to be taken into account when you're making this decision is like certain updates to your generative model, right? And by generative model, I'm referring to this predictive module, right? That sort of generates potential sensory observations, right? That you're using to kind of run the mental simulations and like predict, right? When you are updating this, like some parameters of that generative model, right? That is to say, when you are modifying your prediction instead of acting on the environment, right? When you're choosing what to do, there has to have you need to have some sort of different computational cost that is associated with updating that generative model, right? And different updates need to be scored differently. So here's what I mean by that. Let's come back to the homeostasis analogy, right? And let's say you have an agent that is, that is too hot, who is too hot, right? So the temperature that is read out from the receptors, right, is higher than what it expects, right? How does it decide to either move to a cooler place or stay where it is, right? By changing its belief what the optimal temperature should be, right? Because if you think about it, both of those approaches, they give you the same thing after all, in the sense that both of them minimize the discrepancy, right?
Right.
Ideally to zero. And so in that sense, there are like two alternative choices that are almost equally good. But what I think happened in evolution from the variational free energy minimization objective, right? They are equivalent. They both minimize the discrepancy to zero. And so just how, generally how evolution works, there probably were, more or less half the organisms that employed one strategy and half the organisms that employed another strategy, right? So some of them moved to a cooler place by changing the observations. Some of them updated their generative model to change the prediction. But those that changed the prediction, right, they became too hot and just died, right? Mm-hmm. So there is an evolutionary pressure for organisms, for agents, in that scenario at least, to go and actively sample, right? To take this alternative path. And so what conceptually how I think about it is, because when we are talking about this generative model, right, it's like we're talking about it kind of abstractly, right, some predictive component.
Sure.
But in reality, it's, some networks of neurons, right, that are doing all the information processing and coming up with a prediction. And, changing that, just modifying the parameters of that network would mean to rewire it essentially in a way that would modify the prediction. And so what I think happened is the particular submodule, right, the part of the network that is associated with vital functions like body temperature, right, over the course of evolution, its wiring got, kind of crystallized into one configuration that, that is really hard to change in a way, right? Because for organisms that had, such a that had a different configuration that was easier to change, right? They chose this strategy, and because it's a vital function, they died out, right? So there was an evolutionary pressure to kind of constrain at least those aspects of the generative model to be not so easily rewired, right? And so this is why we have homeostasis, right? Now that basically the only approach is to go and change the sensory evidence, right? No one who are too hungry will just, think, I'm not too hungry, right? That's the optimal level of glucose, everything's fine, right? Because that's just too, metabolically, it's too hard to rewire that network in such a way, because it was shaped by evolution to be not so easily rewirable, right? So yeah, some adjustments have to be, less preferred than others. essentially.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. Do you find yourself, I guess, personal question, in day-to-day life, consciously considering any of these kind of trade-offs? Like, do you, throughout the day, ever say, "Hey, I'm going to update my model here," or "I'm going to update my"? I know. This is kind of a funny question because
Yeah.
almost all of this is happening at a level below our conscious perception, right? But do you, having this knowledge, armed with this knowledge, do you utilize it in the world in any ways?
I mean, when I like think about when I'm thinking about free energy, just for the fun of it, I would be like, oh yeah, let's just think about the everyday aspect of what I'm doing like through that lens, right? Then it's just kind of funny. But yeah, I mean, when I'm not thinking about free energy, yeah, I don't think. I mean, probably subconsciously, right? But
Yeah.
consciously not. I mean,
Okay,
at least I'm not doing it. I don't know whether you are.
I'm not. No, I don't. Maybe I should.
Maybe, yeah, that could
might
be actually an
optimal.
optimal strategy, yeah, but
Perhaps, yeah. Optimizing for what? Then it's
This endless cycle of questions. Okay, it's very interesting. Well, I'm looking forward to see down the pipeline when you start to tackle active inference, free energy. I can't wait to see what you come up with and how you put it together. That'll be
yeah,
a fun series.
yeah. I don't know how it'll turn out. I'm excited to see it too.
But, right. Let's see. So many places I could go here with this. Are you familiar at all with Gregory Bateson, like ecologist? Any of his work?
No.
Yeah, it's not really too important to know about his corpus, but
He's someone I've enjoyed a lot. But he
it's kind of not a metaphysical question, but kind of in that direction, let's say.
because he writes a lot about or has written about the map territory relationship. You've probably heard this: the map is not the territory. This phrase, and I wonder this. It's something that comes to mind quite a bit whenever I'm having deep philosophical conversations, or even with your videos with the brain and these mappings that are happening in the brain. And he has this. It's an excerpt from one of his books. I think it's Ecology of the Mind, where he talks about someone going out into a field, let's say, and they have like a measuring stick, and they sort of do some measurements out in the field. They go home and they start writing down on a piece of paper, drawing out what they recall from the field. And this analogy is this picture is drawn to kind of get across this idea that the thing that's being measured, or there are maps and maps of maps of a thing that we'll say is in reality, that we can perceive as to the best of our ability. But actually attaining and getting to what that thing is like a series of representations. And it's hard to know, or maybe it's impossible to know, when the thing itself is ever being kind of perceived. Does this make any sense? Sorry, I might be...
Yeah, I think...
Yeah, so I guess the question, something I grapple with, something I think is kind of interesting is that, and we can't only do so much with our perceptual systems, but it seems to me that we're always dealing with these like maps and maps of maps of maps, that we're never quite getting to like the essence of the thing itself.
Oh yeah, for sure.
For sure. Okay. Yeah. Do you have this thought in mind, or is this kind of boilerplate stuff? It's not even.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, but I feel like it is, fundamentally impossible to like get into the essence, right? I mean, whatever it is that we call the essence, right? And so the starting point, right, is all of the sensory observations that you are collecting, right? For example, like when I'm looking at that book on the bookshelf, right?
Red book?
Yeah, the red book.
Yeah, I did a video on the red book actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I like, the starting point for like the initial map, right, for me, would be just literally the activations of, of light receptors on the retina, right? And from that, I can it'll go to thalamus, then V1, V2, etc. Right? I can build detect edges, and then there are more abstract modules in the cortex that oh, that's a book, right? That's a rectangular shape, and then the perception of color and everything that has to do with the content of the book, right? It is true that we have this sort of hierarchy of maps, right? The progression, but it sort of starts with the sensory observations, right? And to me, it's almost pretty much irrelevant whether there is something more to it, because there is no such thing as objective reality, right?
Sure. Yeah.
For all you know, you could be, a brain in a jar that somebody's poking with electrodes and such the right pattern that you would see that book, but there is no reality, right? There might not be even such thing as a book, right? So yeah, I just don't feel. I'm sure it's impossible to reason what the objective reality is and how we will be able to understand it in a way, because we'll always be limited by the sensors that we have, right?
Yeah.
So for example, right now I can only perceive the light, right, that is reflected from that book.
Yeah.
But if I had a different sensor, right, if you give me one of those things that sort of you can visualize the heat, right, that can see in the infrared, right, I could see, if there would be some non-homogeneity in how it, in the temperature on the surface of that book, right? Would that's a different modality, right? Would that change my perception of the book, right? Probably is. But again, because the brain is not used to it, because we don't typically have sensors, so we don't have established representations and how to operate with information of that modality, right? I could consciously take into account, well, okay, there seems to be this pattern of temperature on it, so what? But there's probably something an infinite amount of other modalities in the underlying reality that we're not perceiving, right? So yeah, I don't think it's even makes sense to reason about, okay, what is the true underlying nature of that book, right? Because it's inaccessible. And
what about something like just light itself? So it's just a wavelength, and you have a couple million receptors in the eye, and then that's processed in the brain. And so, would it be accurate to say, let's say, and your point's well taken, that we can never quite know the objective truth, but as close as we can get would be something like wavelengths of from the EM spectrum, right? That would be closer, or do you still think that's just too abstract and not concrete enough?
No, you could definitely get to the bottom, you can get to the level of wavelengths.
But then still, it's
but whether it's objective reality or you can get into the level of photons, right, and get to the quantum fluctuations that are happening around that book. But yeah, to me, the only thing that matters is all the information that is relevant for for whatever the objective function of the brain is, right? Well, first of all, it's the information that we can perceive, right, and the part of it that is relevant, right? But again, because the nervous system and all the sensors, they kind of co-evolved, right, to perceive whatever information is necessary, right? Or whatever information is relevant for for maximizing your chances of reproduction in a given environment, right? Yeah, you don't sense EM waves, for example, probably because for you it is pretty much irrelevant.
Yeah, it doesn't help with dating at all. It doesn't help with getting out there. It's not useful for that.
Yeah,
play.
exactly.
Yeah. So, do you have towards your YouTube channel and talk a little bit about what inspired you to start this wonderful channel?
So there were, I'd say, two main factors that kind of just came together. The first one for me was just some need of like a creative outlet, because at the time, I think I was in my third or maybe, yeah, towards the end of my second year of undergraduate studies, and at the time I was really immersed in the lab, like doing research and just reading a whole bunch of literature on hippocampus and theta rhythms.
Yeah.
And I felt, it just suddenly felt like I need some side interests. Like I want to do something, just to like kind of multitask in slow motion. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, I love this idea. There is a TED talk, a very popular one on slow motion multitasking. And it's basically saying that, highly recommend it.
Is that a Cal Newport thing?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Slow motion multitasking.
If you just like search it on YouTube, it'll pop up. But basically, the idea is it's very beneficial when you have multiple projects at once. So you're like multitasking, but you're not switching, right? You're not, talking on the phone and driving. That's like kind of the bad way of multitasking, right? And it refers to the idea that you have multiple creative projects that you're kind of working on in slow motion, right? Then it's beneficial because, before I get to because, for example, a lot of famous people in history did that. So I think one example that is provided in that TED talk is about Einstein. So he was working at the same time on like theory of relativity, and also he was working on like some of his work with lasers, right? So he had like multiple directions of research, and it turned out to be very, very beneficial. And there are other people like Darwin, for example, and basically the idea is when you have multiple endeavors like this, first of all, there is kind of interlinking and like transfer of knowledge, right? So you can there is view that insight is basically just transferring one piece of knowledge to another field and just like seeing connections, right? That nobody noticed before. And when you're doing multiple things, right? When you're immersed in different directions, then it's easier to see the connections between them, right? And you can uniquely transfer the skills. But it also gives you like the time to kind of, when your brain becomes overloaded with one thing, right? You just cannot process it anymore, right? Your RAM is full, right? You need to switch to something different, right? To focus on something different and let your like unconscious, like deeper levels, right? To kind of work on this problem subconsciously, right? And then you can generate insight that way to make progress. And it also serves as kind of emotional safety net, in the sense that if things are going bad in one project, then you're not discouraged, right? You always have something to switch to, right? And well, at least in that direction, everything is going good, right? So like something motivates to keep you forward, right? And when you sort of switch in between the two, you're kind of alternating, right? And it was for me. I just realized that I needed to do something on the side, other than just spend like every waking hour, working in the lab and just reading papers. And over the years, there is a siren there.
That's okay.
But over the years, I've noticed that oftentimes when things are not going so well in the lab, I'm not seeing the results that are expected, or like the code doesn't work I'm like, well, at least the YouTube channel is doing good. Or like
Yeah.
the other way around, like I'm supposed to script a video, but I have no idea like how to start. Like, I have this piece of animation that is not working, but I would be like, well, at least, things in the lab are promising. That's like kind of, motivates you to keep forward in both directions. And another thing that motivated me to start was, this is what determined why I started an educational channel. Or in the beginning, I was doing like productivity videos, but
I still do some, yeah.
I mean, occasionally, but it's going towards more and more into neuro AI stuff. But it was the idea that it is basically the most effective way to learn, and I'm sure you know it when you're preparing for podcasts, right? It's like a direct practice when you have a project that you're working on, and especially when you have the task of explaining something to other people, right? That's literally the most effective way to learn something new, is to try to teach it, right? And especially if you're trying to put it in very simple terms. I think it was Richard Feynman who said it, right? I may be wrong, but I have the impression that it was him who said that if you cannot explain something to like a 5-year-old, that you don't really understand it, right? And this is what I've also encountered multiple times in my YouTube journey, is that I have some idea about some model, right? I have the internal feeling is I clearly understand it, and then I try to write a script, I try to explain it simply, and I would be like, oh, no, I don't really understand what's going on. So it's just a way to kind of identify, like blank spots in your understanding of the material.
Oh yeah, 100%. I've been there so many times where a research topic, I think I know how to explain it, and I go down and write the script, and it's like, oh, I don't know anything. Like I have to rework this, and oh, there's this gap in knowledge, and then you're down on some other rabbit hole of information that'll take you down. But I totally agree that there's no better way to understand something than to explain it, or to at least try to explain it. So yeah, that's really cool. And another thing too, I'm sure that helps with the retention of information is in the editing process, you end up hearing over and over again.
Oh yeah.
The same things, you might hear it 50 times. And so that really gets it stuck in the brain, I think, for a long period of time.
Oh yeah. Like when I'm editing, I feel like even to this day, if you just like prompt me with like a few sentences like from the beginning, I will just like continue the script.
You can just keep going, right?
And it was a funny thing. I think when I was interviewing for graduate positions here at NYU, I was asked, or it may be not NYU, but anyway, I was interviewing to multiple schools, and on one of the interviews, I was asked the question on like theta rhythms and like what it might be doing. And I was working on theta rhythm at the time. I published it like a month prior to that. And the script was still fresh in my memory, so I just recited the portion of it. Yeah, it seemed to be a satisfying answer.
Right. Yeah, it's as good as you can get it, right? That was like a finely polished script that you wrote, so just regurgitate that. That's awesome. What kind of feedback have you
received from the channel, either professionally and or like commenters,
and how,
like from that feedback, has any of it influenced your content creation process?
Yeah, I'd say I'm very fortunate to receive a lot of feedback, both in the comment section and like in private email, like both private conversations in real life, and occasionally get emails from people. Yeah. Unfortunately, I cannot physically reply to all of them.
Sure.
Yeah, but I'm really happy when like a lot of people tell me that like it really helps them to understand a particular concept, or even like motivate them to go to computational neuroscience, which, yeah, always super nice to hear.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'd say, in terms of video creation, it's mostly, in terms of like negative constructive feedback, it's mostly like, like tiny technical details. Well, okay, one thing, it turns out, like, I often get things wrong in my videos. That's just how it happens. Yeah, especially, I think a lot of it happened in the wavelet transform video, because it's a mathematically advanced topic. And yeah, I'm not a math major, so like I did my best to like understand the formal theory, right, behind wavelet transform. But a lot of people in the comments kept telling me that I drastically misinterpreted the I was talking about Heisenberg uncertainty principle, like the trade-off between like sort of frequency and time resolution, right? I mean, the big picture view was right, that you can't really know both, but yeah, I messed up some mathematical details. Yeah, that was unfortunate, but yeah, and a lot of other things like going back, if I just look at my previous videos, in preparation for this podcast, I actually this morning I rewatched the brain criticality video because I almost forgot it at this point. Yeah, and I was looking at it, and I would be like looking at some of the animations, and I think back in the day I still loved playing with the wiggle effects in After Effects, and everything would be wiggling. Every graph would be like wobbling. Yeah, because like it sort of when there is a lot of motion, right? It sort of keeps the attention, right? At least that's what I thought. All of these like online influencers, right? They like everything is jumping around to keep the viewer's attention. Yeah, but like when I rewatched that video, I realized that why is this graph wiggling? It shouldn't do that. It's just distracting. Yeah, and so it's tiny things like that. But
I never felt like it was distracting. I mean, from one person's perspective, I feel like the animated, say, text, and it comes on the screen and it's like moving a little bit. I think it's actually
I mean, the text is fine. But for some reason, it was like the graph, and it was not like not only was wiggling in its position, right, but the scale of it was also wiggling, and like not uniformly, so it would be like warping around. And I think it's because I watched the video on the 2x speed, so it was like more prominent than
2x speed. Thank goodness for that, right?
Burn through videos quickly.
So you said you started the channel for a creative outlet. Now, if you were, let's say you can't do anything on, say, neuroscience or productivity, and you were going to start a new channel, so something just completely outside those two topics. If you had to start a new channel, what would you focus on?
Can I do machine learning? Or it's
not machine learning. Yeah, let's just say, I don't know, some fun thing, something like outside.
Man, it's hard to. I think I would be like, all of the. I mean, it may be cheating because it's related, but like the sort of the technical aspects of how I do the animations.
Okay.
So like the Python, tips on how to make scientific, like data visualization and like animation in Python or like in Blender. Yeah, because there is a lot of topics that I feel like underexplored. So yeah, I mean, like people are using, for example, matplotlib, right, which is the most popular Python library for plotting, right, and people are using it in publications everywhere, right, when you just want to create a graph.
Yeah,
but I realized that there is a lot of really complex and really beautiful animations you can make with it, and especially when you combine it with other tools like Blender or like After Effects. So I mentioned it briefly in the video that I have, which sort of where I kind of deconstruct the creation process behind some of the animations. Yeah, I kind of like showcased it a little bit, but you can make some like the template, like some supporting assets, so to speak, in Matplotlib, right? And then use those images, for example, to drive some like crazy animation in Blender, like making like glow effects, so that like just looking at it, you will not even suspect that it is like Matplotlib was involved there somehow. Yeah, but there is a lot of interesting ways how you can like combine different pieces of software, especially when you're trying to kind of achieve the optimal level, like when you're doing some procedural animations, right, or like mathematical animations that require some coding, right? If you want to showcase a graph, right, or let's say, for example, the wavelet function, right? You can do it, like you can draw it, right? But nobody would actually like draw it by hand, right? Because it will not be imprecise. It'll be imprecise, right? You want to show the actual the mathematical graph or a function, right? How it looks like. But yeah, at the same time, you want it to be like animated. You want it to be like sort of flying around, so like all the text, all the effects. Yeah, it's just like a lot of interesting ways how you can combine different software to achieve that.
Yeah, that's very cool. I think one thing I'd love to see is, and maybe it's on your, I don't think it's on your channel, but your favorite like lo-fi playlist for studying.
Oh yeah, I do have my absolute favorite one. I still use it today. I think I started it. So after my freshman year in undergraduate, it was during COVID. So yeah, we had like during the summer I basically stayed at home, and it was like after freshman year, so I didn't have any sophisticated linear algebra background. But I decided to, okay, summer, time for me to self-study linear algebra. And so I would read Gilbert Strang's book. I would watch his lectures and then like read the book and do the problem sets. And then I used the same playlist. I think it's like 1 hour or maybe like 90 minutes, something like that. Every morning, like I would wake up at like 8 and then do the linear algebra for 2 hours, listening to the same playlist. And over the course of like 2 months, it became so embedded into my memory, and I still kind of associate it with like deep intellectual work. And I only put it on when I'm reading something super complicated, and it puts me into the right level of focus instantly. It's like almost a biological reaction at this point. When I hear this music, I go into the focus exactly. Yeah, and I can send you the link. I can put it in the description.
Send me the link. It'll be in the description. Yeah, we get this super amazing. Get your brain waves in the right state. I don't know if you're familiar with the binaural beats.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the concept. I don't think I mean, I've tried it multiple times. I didn't notice any like drastic effects.
Yeah.
I just like lo-fi music.
Me too.
I do. The like themed playlist, or like this is the playlist I'm using for like coding. This is the playlist for writing scripts.
Right.
And, yes.
That's really cool. It's very nerdy, but I have a medieval music lo-fi playlist.
Oh yeah, that one is nice. If we're thinking about the same thing.
What are you thinking about? Oh no, I have my
medieval.
Own.
Yeah.
You
have your.
I have my own.
Oh wow.
On Spotify. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It's like.
It's ridiculous. It's so nerdy. But if I'm playing like a medieval fantasy game or something, because sometimes the music in a video game you've heard it a lot. So sometimes I'll be like, to mix it up. I'll play my own mix while playing some Skyrim or something like that. Do you play video games at all? Are you?
I play Hearthstone a little bit.
Hearthstone. Okay. A card game.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, but like very rarely.
Yeah. Any other hobbies?
Other than YouTube, I wouldn't say so. Yeah, it's like I usually either work in the lab or work on my YouTube when I have free time. So.
Yeah, so it's pretty busy. It's a pretty busy life right there. And what do you think of New York so far?
I have mixed feelings about New York as a city.
Okay, that's it.
I mean, I've gotten used to it. I feel like right now, yeah, I just got, gotten into it. Yeah, because I moved from Moscow, so I lived, I mean, counting COVID because I was home at COVID, but like around three years in total, almost 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can imagine, like, in many ways, New York is like, if you just imagine New York, right, and you get rid of all the trash in the streets, all the homeless people, and you have a subway that is like as clean as, that is very clean, whose stations look like, like rooms in a museum, and yeah, where trains run every 90 seconds. There is a train.
That's
yeah. Here I have to wait for the train like sometimes 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But in other ways, like the general vibe, right, and like how you feel, it's pretty similar. Yeah.
It's pretty similar to Moscow.
Yeah, exactly. So like,
but Moscow's better. Sounds like.
Yeah, I mean,
your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a very biased opinion, but I would say,
sure,
Moscow is probably one of the best cities to live in right now on Earth. Yeah, but even now when I'm like walking around the lab, which is at Flatiron Institute, right, and there is a very nice Madison Square Park there. So yeah, when I'm walking around the park, see the Flatiron building, right? Right now it's being renovated, but it's still pretty cool. Yeah, sometimes I have the deja vu feeling, like it feels like certain places in Moscow, especially like when you're near the park, right? Because there is a lot of green areas and a lot more open space there. So yeah, when I'm in New York, around like parks and stuff, yeah, feels a lot like Moscow. But yeah, but it's a fun city. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. I like living in New York so far. All in all.
That's good to hear. And do you mean actually like deja vu, like the deja vu feeling, or something akin to it?
Well, something akin to it. Yeah. It's just
okay.
like, oh yeah, that feels about right.
Right. Do you have any thoughts about deja vu in general with the brain? Have you read
I mean, remind me of the correct definition, because I always thought that was like just a feeling that, something like, okay, maybe deja vu is not the right word though.
Oh, I don't mean to pick on the words. I'm actually interested in deja vu in general. Yeah.
Remind me the definition of it again.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I perceive, like what I consider to be something like when you're experiencing something that feels like you've lived it before, or it's like almost like reliving a memory in the moment, something akin to that. Something that seems you're experiencing it for the first time. It's happening. This is all happening in real time, right? Or your moment of existence is happening, but it feels like familiar in a way that feels like almost like you've experienced it before. That's how I've always thought of deja vu, but I'll have to take another look at it after the fact. And
yeah. Then probably Then I would, with that in mind, I wouldn't say it's like a deja vu. It's just the feeling that that something reminds you of like another place really strongly, right? And just kind of put into the state of mind that you were like in a similar kind of state of mind that you were, in that other place. So yeah, it's just
cool. Very nice. And what else? Like, you've teased a little bit about active inference. Is that the next topic you're going to tackle? Any future content that you want to tease for the audience? Things that we can look forward to?
Yeah. So active inference is further down the line.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now I decided to kind of start. Basically, I was like thinking of, okay, what would be the best, like, how would I start this journey, right? And I would think, I thought, active inference, variational free energy, right? You're kind of getting into like degenerative models, right? And energy-based models. And then the concept of Boltzmann machines is like very, very similar, like very related to it, right? Because they're generative, kind of like the generative models, basically. But to explain Boltzmann machines, I would have to start with Hopfield networks, and I feel like, basically, long story short, right now I'm finishing editing the video. Should be out in hopefully like between a week and 2 weeks, around that time horizon, on Hopfield networks. And that would be the foundational video to like extend it to Boltzmann machines and all that stuff from there. I don't have the exact schedule.
Worked out. Can you give me a teaser? What is a Hopfield network?
So Hopfield network is basically a very simple but influential model of associative memory, and in particular, it's the idea of a content addressable memory. So, for example, using the analogy that we discussed a few minutes ago, right? When you are walking in a new place, right? And it reminds you of something, right? You build this association, right? You're like, oh, I've seen this before, right? But like, how does your brain do it? Because let's suppose there is some way for you to, if you have two memories, you can like take some sort of a dot product and measure how one memory is similar to another one, right? If you're having a new input, in order for you to find the memory that is associated with it, you'd have to, go through all memories that you have, search through them, right? Compute the similarity and just find the best match, right? But the number of memories that you have stored in your brain is, depends on the definition of a memory, but it's a lot of information, right? You just cannot explicitly iterate through all of them and like search for a match, right? And how do you kind of query what you know, right, from like the partial or associated stimulus, right? How do you find this matching without actually looping over all of your memories, right? And that's the idea of the content addressable memory, that somehow you can find, you have some number of memories that are stored, and when you receive a new one, you can like find the one that is closest to it, without explicitly going through all of them and checking. And it basically the rough idea is that you have a system that can store memory in its states, right? You can think of it as like the network of neurons, right? And your memory is encoded in activations of all of those neurons, right? So like a binary pattern for now, right? Then your neurons are connected with certain weights, and those weights define what is called the energy landscape of the system. So you can associate each state with its energy, which is like a positive number, right? Some states have high energy, other states have low energy, depending on how the state aligns with the connection weights, right? So the connection weights between the neurons define which states are favorable and which are not favorable, right? And so, for example, when you're storing the memory, you are tweaking the weights in such a way to kind of dig an energy well, like a local minimum in that energy surface around a particular memory, right? And then yeah, when you're storing, you're kind of shaping this energy landscape. You'll have multiple local minima corresponding to distinct memories.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you are queried with some like noisy or partial version of one of the memories, right, it sort of maps to some point, right? It's a state, right, and it maps to a point on this energy surface, right, corresponding to that state, which has a higher energy than, you know, the memories that you stored, right? And then there is an iterative process, which is like basically like a ball rolling down the hill on this energy surface to kind of descend into the local minimum that is closest to the initial state, right? To the one that you were queried with. And yeah, it's very similar to how, you know, when you're searching for when you're training a neural network, right? There is a lot of different configuration of weights. And one way you could do is to try all of them and then just run the network with a whole bunch of them and like see what performs best, right? That would be like the exhaustive search over the space of all possible of all possible parameters of the network, right? But that's intractable because this space is just too high dimensional. And in optimization, what you do is you basically, anyway, with the optimization objective, instead of searching through all the possible configurations, you kind of start with some initial random state, right? And then you have the gradient descent to basically approach the local minimum in the loss surface, right? So it's kind of analogous to in that sense that, but instead of, you know, descending along the loss surface to find the set of parameters, right? Instead, your inference is now a descent along the energy surface, right? So this is why you can like, you're not searching through all memories explicitly, right? You're just iteratively descending along the one that is, like you're descending to the one that has like the local minimum that is nearest to it. But you can descend into the wrong local minimum, right? Or you can recall some weird intermediate states, right? So like you're not searching for the best possible memory, right? You're kind of, that gets you close enough, right? Similar to how you could get trapped in a local minimum when you are doing an optimization, when you're training a network, for example. Yeah, so it's this idea how you can basically like sculpt energy landscape to associate with certain memories with minimum, and then when you're trying to content address that memory, so you're like trying to reconstruct the full memory from only a part of it, or like the noisy version, right? So you can do like a pattern completion or noise correction, right? You can do just the descent along the energy surface to find the nearest local minimum, right? And although vanilla Hopfield networks, they're not used in practice because they're really, the capacity how many memories you can store is pretty low, at least in the oldest formulation published like in the 80s by Hopfield, right? But there are generalizations of it to like make them more practical, right? And there is actually like the modern formulation, or rather reformulation of Hopfield networks that is shown to be equivalent to the transformer architecture. So they're closely connected to like a lot of concepts in machine learning. But I feel like it's a great starting point because historically they were the first. If you like look at, you know, the evolution, there are Hopfield networks, then like Boltzmann machines, then Helmholtz machines, and, you know, all of that like generative, you know, kind of energy-based modeling. Yeah, but Hopfield networks were at the start, and even though in the most original formulation they are like super simple, and they're not usable at all in practice, but just conceptually, I feel like they are an important stepping stone.
Wow, fascinating.
Can't wait to see the video. That's going to be very exciting. And apologies for the background noise. The last few minutes, we'll see how that comes out.
Yeah, let's just hope that noise reduction does its job.
Yeah, we'll try it out and see. Yeah, hopefully it'll localize and be okay. But great. I think we're coming up on time here. Anything else you want to share? Anything you want to add or put a button on the conversation?
I don't know. I feel like it's been we've covered a lot of topics.
I think so. Yeah, we really have.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure getting to know you and getting to poke around your brain a little bit and ask you questions about. There's stuff in here that I will certainly have to go on some research rabbit holes to dig in further. And as we talked about throughout the conversation, there'll be links in the description for viewers and listeners who want to dive deeper into topics. And I'll include, of course, links to your channel and some of my favorite videos of yours, if that's cool with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, thanks again. And
right.
it's been a pleasure, Artem.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.